Hello guys, welcome to another video, and this one I wanted to do a bit of discussion on this shield right here, the Draugur's Lantern, which is a new unique shield that came into the game, actually not in 3.29, but in 3.29.1, so if you haven't really been paying attention to patches that came out after the launch of 3.29, you may have missed this shield being added to the game. But this is a new unique here, and it has an interesting new mechanic on it. It's called Draugurflames, and it says, Draugurflames burn enemies around you for 8 seconds after you ignite a target. And now that we have these cool dropout things here, we can actually see exactly what that is. So it says, Draugurflames burn enemies within 3 meters of you, dealing fire damage equal to 15% of the damage per second of the strongest ignite you've inflicted in the past 8 seconds. This damage cannot be modified. That, of course, is because the damage has already been modified once by all of your modifiers to ignite to actually account for the damage that it's going to deal. So, this obviously is really good with Chieftain because of Hinekora, which is exactly what I'm doing right here. So, Hinekora Death's Fury is a node there that allows you to have a chance to explode enemies when you actually kill them, and they explode in a radius around them, dealing 250% of their maximum life as fire damage. You can then ignite with that. Of course, that's the basic setup for Chieftain RF. And what this means with this shield is that because this is 15% of the damage coming as like an aura around you, you're essentially getting around 37.5% of monster life as an ignite in this kind of aura-like effect, and that lasts for 8 seconds. Now, 15% doesn't sound like a lot, but the thing is, when you get a huge ignite with Chieftain and Hinekora, everyone knows just how powerful that is. You're able to pro-lift that ignite out, and it does a huge amount of damage. Anything in the radius, when it's a big monster, anything around it just instantly dies. Anything that doesn't instantly die, dies to the ignite. Because this is 8 seconds long, and it's not modified by anything to do with ignite duration or anything like that, this is really, really powerful when you're able to actually get a huge explosion going. For example, I've been doing Legion with this. It's been really, really effective at Legion farming, and Chieftain is already fantastic at Legion, but this shield just kind of takes it one step further because you have a huge amount of rares on your screen at once, and the chance of you actually being able to explode one of those rares with Hinekora is really high. And once you actually get one of those explosions and that explosion causes an ignite, you then have 15% of that ignite as an area effect around you for 8 seconds. And that 8 seconds, you're able to just deal with the rest of the Legion encounter or whatever else. It just does so much damage. You will actually be able to see that in the footage there, that even things like the generals in a Legion encounter just get absolutely melted by this 15% damage. It's really quite strong. It does mean that you're able to actually scale the damage a little bit differently, though, compared to what you would usually do with an RF build. I'm actually doing something different here, which I'll discuss in a moment. But before we get there, I wanted to discuss my original ideas for actually scaling up this Draugurflames buff here. Because when it gets placed on you, it's based on that large ignite that you actually inflict on other targets. And that means that all of your damage modifiers that go into an ignite actually scaling up the damage is baked into that Draugurflames buff for 8 seconds. So the interesting thing here is that the duration of this buff doesn't get changed by anything to do with ignite. So any kind of, faster ignites and things like that. For example, this node up here where you inflict your ignites faster, or this damaging ailments node here. These things make ignite deal its damage over a shorter period because it's essentially dealing that damage faster. But it won't affect the Draugurflames buff timer, but it will affect the damage that it deals, because the Ignite is now dealing much more damage. That's why this shield itself actually has that modifier on it. Ignite, you inflict, deal damage faster. So, originally, when I first thought about this shield, what I wanted to do was get a huge amount of Ignites dealing their damage faster. So, for example, you could make use of Replica Emberwake there, which has 90% reduced Ignite duration, which, isn't very good at all. And then Ignites you inflict, deal damage 51% faster. That actually scales up to 60% and can go even higher with a Volatile Val Orb. So that becomes very, very strong. And really, the Ignite duration there starts to become less and less relevant when you're actually thinking about scaling this shield, because what you really want is to get your Ignite as strong as possible so that this Draugurflame buff is really, really powerful on its own, and this kind of carries all of your damage. Because even when you get a huge Ignite on a target and it disappears very, very quickly, of course that Ignite is probably going to wipe out everything immediately, but anything else that you then move on towards and kill further on, which the Ignite Prolift didn't get to, you then have the Draugurflame buff to rely on for the next 8 seconds. So that was my original idea behind scaling this. I was going to kind of come over here and grab all of this faster ignite stuff here, and also maybe even come down here or anoint this one here, and just generally scale up faster ignite so that you had a really high amount of ignite damage. You'd also scale up, fire.multi, more fire damage, increased fire damage, that kind of stuff. But I actually landed on a different setup here, which I'll discuss what I'm doing. So, usually on Chieftain, on an RF build, you're using Ramako Sun's Light, which means when you're stationary, nearby monsters have minus 20% fire resistance to your damage over time. Minus 20% is really good, especially when you consider some auto modifiers that set monster resistance to things like 80% or even more than that. It's really good to be able to set them to minus 20%. Well, I'm doing something different here. I'm actually using these rings here, the Will of Xoph. And this is a ring that came into the game back in 3.27. It comes from the new Breach bosses. And this one here has a modifier that says increases and reductions to fire damage also apply to effects of auras from fire skills at 15% of their value, up to a maximum of 150%. Now that means that usually to cap that out at 150% with the max roll there of 15, you would need 1000% increased fire damage, and do note that this only works specifically with fire damage. So, things like this node here that grants 10% increased fire damage, that would work, but a node that gives you 10% increased damage or 10% increased elemental damage wouldn't work. It does have to be specifically fire damage. So, when you actually use two of these rings, that maximum 150% doesn't increase, but it means that you're able to more easily reach the cap of 150%, because now instead of needing 1000% fire damage, you only need 500. So I'm using two of these, and that means that I only need 500% increased fire damage to reach 150% increased effect of auras, and those auras specifically need to be ones with a fire tag. Now, to get that increased fire damage, I'm using a node that barely anybody uses on Chieftain, which is Ngamahu Flames Advance, which says non-unique jewels cause increases and reductions to other damage types in large radius to be transformed to apply to fire damage, and it also grants you a +4 to strength on nodes in those radius jewels as well. And so you can have a look here. I'm using some jewels here to actually make sure all of these nodes here, for example, this is usually 10% increased elemental damage, it's now 10% increased fire damage, and this is usually 24% increased elemental, it's now 24% increased fire. That's the same for all these nodes here. This one in particular is quite important because it's 50%, but from a damage perspective, these things here, usually 50% increased elemental damage, 50% increased fire damage, they'd be the same if you were doing a fire damage build. But in this particular build, we want increased fire damage specifically for these rings. So this is actually really quite effective. It also means that up here, we can actually make use of this huge wheel here to lightning damage, because all of it grants fire damage instead because of this radius. And we can also go over here if we want and grab all of these nodes because they're also increased fire damage. And on top of that, we get the bonus of kind of gaining a bunch of extra flat life from the strength scaling. This build actually has almost 500 strength without really investing anything into strength. So, for example, that works on Purity of Fire, because that has a fire tag. So this one right here is getting, the 4% base effect there, and then if we also add in our aura effect, it's going to be granting quite a bit more there. We can actually turn that off and see exactly what that's doing for me right now. And right here I have, 80% maximum fire resistance, so when I actually, equip that aura and actually turn it on there, 90%. So right now it's giving me 10%, and obviously that could be a level 23 gem, at which point the base would be 5%. And another thing that it works on there is Pyroclast Mine of Sabotage, because this is a mine that has an aura and it has the fire tag, and this has fire exposure aura applies minus 25% to fire resistance, and that one there is going to be buffed up because it's also an aura. So once again, the minus 25% is being multiplied by the aura effects coming from these rings. So with the 150% increase there, it would bring it up to, 62% or something like that. But this is also being buffed by another new thing that I'm using in this build, which is the Aspect of Solaris. I actually done a recent video on this where I discussed this new Aspect skill because it's really quite good. And this one is essentially a skill here which applies this effect around you. It's almost like an aura type effect, but it's not scaled by any aura modifiers. But it means that enemies near you are actually going to be inflicted with fire exposure at a base 10%. And then on the tree here, we can use the Fire Mastery, which is fire exposure applies an extra minus 5%. So with that combined, the base fire exposure is minus 15%. And then, of course, this skill right here actually scales it up every second by 15%. So that means with the base 15% exposure there, and with the 75% increased effect, you'd have about a 26% fire exposure, which is quite nice. But whenever we actually encounter a single target that's quite tanky, we can instead drop our Pyroclast Mine of Sabotage, which also inflicts fire exposure, but that one is a much higher base exposure of 25%. Add to that the 5% coming from the passive tree, and that's a 30% base fire exposure. And note that the exposure effect from Aspect of Solaris and the aura effects coming from the rings, those things are additive in terms of scaling this up. But even so, that ends up going from a 30% exposure to a 97% fire exposure coming from this, because that's, multiplied by the 150% aura effect and then the 75% effect of exposure coming in, for a total 225% increased effect of this exposure, which is really quite strong. So we're able to drop that whenever we reach a single target to be able to deal a bit of extra damage. However, the increased aura effect also works on flammability if it's turned into an aura using Blasphemy or Eldritch Blasphemy. So this is another way to actually benefit from these rings here, is by increasing the aura effect up of flammability. So this one right here is a level 22 gem right now, and this has a minus 38% to fire resistance. Note that Blasphemy and Eldritch Blasphemy both have a 25% less effect of supported curses, so you do need to take that into account. But even with that, this minus 38% is being scaled up to 71% minus fire resistance, and that is in a huge area around us because it's being increased by this. This thing here has 85% increased effect of supported curse skills, and because these rings here impose a pretty nasty reduced reservation efficiency modifier, this is actually close to the best you can get here, because this rolls up to 35% reduced reservation efficiency. This one here is 21, and this one is also 21. So that means you have to kind of deal with this huge amount of reduced reservation efficiency of skills. I'm actually using Impresence in this build, and I have Flammability has no reservation if cast as an aura. So that is really quite strong. It means that I can use things like increased area of effect in here without getting any kind of reservation multiplier. And when I actually gain a little bit more currency there and I can invest into getting a better anoint on here, it's going to be Whispers of Doom for an extra curse. And this Impresence here also has Punishment, has no reservation if cast as an aura. And I'll then be able to toggle on Punishment because it's currently turned off, because, I can't use it right now. But once you actually have all of that minus resistance scaling coming from, the exposure aura there and the flammability aura, I then have Eye of Malice, which is this modifier here. Nearby enemies have 50% increased fire and cold resistance. So, if a nearby target has something like minus 100% fire resistance just from the exposure plus the curse, that's going to get to minus 150%. And you can imagine this is really, really good on monsters that don't have any base resistance, but even against ones that do have base resistance, for example, a boss, I'm still going to be able to get them into the very low negatives of fire resistance there. And really, the idea behind this setup is that I can just, use this Draugurflames area of effect to just deal all of the damage, and I don't really have to do much of anything else. I can just run around, and that is kind of the idea of the build. However, I do want to kind of revisit this idea of doing faster ignites, because I think that's a really cool idea. I just kind of landed on this, and this is what I'm doing. This character is still kind of new here. I'm only level 93. I don't really have great gear. Like, look at this weapon, for example. It's just like literally a 2-mod weapon. Like, what is this? I have a 5-link, these items are really, really not good at all. But I just kind of threw this together, and this is what I've been doing, and it's been really quite fun. But that's about it. I just wanted to cover this shield a little bit, talk about it a little bit. I think it's a really cool shield. I think that, for the most part, it's essentially kind of doubling down into the Chieftain playstyle of the whole RF, just exploding things and damaging everything around you. But it's just more of the same. But there are a few interesting ways that you can actually scale this up. I will look into the faster ignites version, because I think that's going to be quite good. And the last thing I'll say about this shield is that you can indeed take the Draugurflames modifier off of that, and it's the same effectiveness modifier. It's still 8 seconds, it's still the same 15%, and you can have it as an implicit by using the Legion Vestigial Unique System. So you can see right here, I actually placed one of those into the Legion and managed to get this out, which is, this is okay. This is not a bad shield at all. Right now, I think I prefer the faster ignites on here, But ideally, I think for this character, because I'm lacking physical damage mitigation, it would be really quite nice to be able to get this on a high armor shield, but that's something you could look into if you wanted to use this. But that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.